Above me is the vesicle Pisces, and this shape is a Christian symbol that was very important to one of the architects, Howard Raggett. And it's a shape that's seen throughout Canberra. It's also employed at Parliament House and actually inverted there to form the core of the seat of government in Australia. Another shape that's repeated throughout the museum is the five-sided pentagon, a shape that represents harmony. But it's instantly recognised by people all over the world as a childlike drawing of a house. Around in the atrium we've got three pods that represent what's behind us in the permanent galleries, and they're major clues to the start of the journey through Australian history. This is the Muttaburrasaurus, which represents the Australian environment. Overhead we have the bogong moth, which is native to Canberra and represents the Gallery of First Australians. And we have the Holden and Caravan in the far corner that represents life in Australia. The atrium is a place of activity and knowledge, just as the architects originally envisaged. It's also a reflective space where people can sit and reflect on the journey they've experienced through the museum. It's a place to sit and think about where you fit within our culture and our history.
It's certainly a really interesting building with a whole lot of symbology in it. Before we get into the building, can I ask, what is the Swain Fellowship and why is the museum creating a centre for design?
The Swain Fellowship is in honour of Alistair Swain, who was a very popular and prominent architect in Canberra and across Australia, who sadly passed away in 2016. And he was so invested in Australian design that before he did pass away, he managed to develop a foundation to really explore the potential that we have in design to contribute to the development of our daily lives. And the Swain Foundation and the National Museum of Australia have now aligned to create a design centre here that's able to work with our social history, to work with all the stories in Australia of our development and bring in design and talk about the future of design and how we can develop as a very strong community and nation.
It certainly sounds like you've got a big job ahead of you, Adrian. So it became very clear watching the tour that you took us on that the museum is a very layered and complex design. Is there a particular piece that stands out to you as being a favourite or being particularly fun or clever?
Well, in the short piece that you've just watched, we're only talking really about one very small component, or perhaps large, but one component of the building, and that is the core, the atrium. But I think because I am a landscape architect, one of my favourite areas of the museum is the Garden of Australian Dreams, which is outside in the central core of the whole complex, and I find it a really interesting and exciting piece of design that's so layered and so complex it takes many visits to explore and think about what's happening there.
It's definitely one of my favourite lunch spots.
Yes.
So early in the piece, you talked about an unmonumental design, which is an interesting phrase. What does it mean and how does the museum differ from other institutions?
It's quite an unusual approach because in an Act of Parliament in 1980, it was determined that this building would celebrate our Federation anniversary on March 11th, 2001, and it was particularly important from the government's perspective that the Social History Museum of Australia would be more populist in its approach, that it would engage with a broader community, that it wasn't really referencing the classical and traditional architecture of perhaps our cultural cousins in Canberra. So it was important that although this huge building had to encompass so much, so many stories, so many exhibits, that it still had a very open and approachable and accessible architecture for all to enter.
We're starting to get some questions coming in off the live stream, which is great. Shakri says, I love the symbology. Why is there so much through the museum?
As I mentioned in the short video, there isn't one thread of history that this museum is addressing. There are multiple threads. There are many, many stories. And one way to incorporate so many aspects of these stories and so many pieces of information is by the repetition of symbology and pattern that you see throughout this museum. And so by using very recognisable, familiar symbols, when people walk into the atrium and throughout the whole museum, there's a feeling of familiarity, of memories. It makes people feel comfortable and feel part of the actual architecture.
Oh, this is a great question. This is from Norma, also on the live stream. What's the most controversial architectural detail of the museum? That's a massive question.
It's a massive question because there's actually quite a lot of controversy, and having worked here for a year, I know that people enjoy talking about it, exploring it, discussing it, working out what's fact, what's fiction. I think that it was really part of the architect's approach to embed some mystery, some mythology, some various things that can be read and reread and misread by many different people. It allows people to develop their own story, their own narrative, but there are a couple of major points that are often discussed. One is the large dots on the facade of the building that are believed to be Braille references to various aspects of Indigenous history, and saying terminology like sorry, etc. And there is also the very well-known shape of the Gallery of First Australians. By aerial view, you can see a very similar deconstructed Star of David, similar to the Jewish Holocaust Museum. The architects were very careful to point out that in no way were these kind of architectural references meant as plagiarism, they were meant as quotations. So they were bringing in aspects of a broader global history in order to talk about everything that has happened in the history of Australia.
Creating let me try that one again. Creating allegorical representations in the architecture. Yeah. There's always something new to find here. Alana has just popped up with a question. Did it take 3 years to build the museum? That seems, how was this achieved? Yeah, it does seem pretty fast for a building of this size.
It's significantly fast, and because of the long term and time that it took to determine where the museum was going to be sited, who was going to be the architects, obviously there was a great deal of discussion and investment in this in the 80s in Australia. It had to be created and built and ready to open on March 11th, 2001. That was the celebration of our federation. So all of the parties involved in the design and construction of this museum entered an alliance, and it isn't a commonly used form of contractual agreement in construction. It means that there is no claim, no blame, I think is one way of sort of referring to it. But it essentially meant that all of the parties were really forced to work together, pull together, work collaboratively to overcome problems before they became insurmountable. And by approaching it this way, it meant that very tight time frame of 3 years was achieved.
Yeah, I remember the building, you mentioned the opening date, March 11, 2001. I came in here I'm doing this at 13, but I was still this tall at 13. And I remember being really blown away by the space then.
Yeah, I can imagine.
David has sent in a question and a comment. The complex design reflects the huge range of social history. Thanks for helping me to understand. Thank you very much, David. And as always, it's lovely to have you watching the live stream. He does say it's not huge though. It's pretty big. Do you have to store much of the collection off-site?
Unfortunately we do, which there's a very huge warehouse further away from the museum that stores a massive amount of extraordinary objects from well, essentially, of course, from our history, but it's a pity in a way that it does have to be stored off-site and that not all of it is visible at any one time. It would be fantastic to consider building a new type of storage facility that is more accessible to people so that it is part of the story. But yes, at the present time, there's other storage sites, and the museum teams work very hard to circulate and bring new objects and move things around so that that audiences are able to see as much as possible of the National Historical Collection.
I think the figures are something like 3% of the collection is on display.
Yeah, it's
so
quite small.
That's
it's quite small.
97% that's tucked away in our warehouses, but we do try and cycle it through. As a slight segue, we're actually out at one of those warehouses on Thursday next week. We're coming to the end of our program. If you have any final questions, please send them through. We really want to get to everybody. Are the windows actually the shape of the Sydney Opera House? And what's the significance of this shape? That's coming from our live audience.
I think that this is one of the, it's actually behind me if you can see it on camera, but I think this is one of the most sort of thought-provoking or it evokes memories for many people. It's very recognisable when you walk in and you sort of get this sweep of sail in the windows. And the story, I believe, is that the shape is actually not referencing the original design of Jorn Utzon's design, but actually the design of the architect who replaced him when he was removed from the project. The architects were very aware of cultural cringe when they were developing the design for this museum, and they were trying to address some of this by looking at all different aspects of architecture, the way that it develops and changes, and the way that it tells many of our stories.
They're certainly a beautiful feature. I love being outside on the lakeside
beautiful
when they're
day today.
reflecting the lake. They're just stunning. If you're not watching live, or if we haven't got around to answering your question, please pop it in the public comments under the YouTube video. If you leave it in the live chat, we'll lose it, because we would love to get around to answering all your questions, but we do have to wrap up today, I'm sorry to say. I will reiterate that the museum is open, so please do drop by Acton Peninsula, see the Endeavour exhibition, which is just fabulous, visit our shop, visit our cafe. We would love to see you. As I mentioned earlier, next week we're back at Mitchell talking to conservators Jennifer Bryan and Michelle Newton-Edwards. So that's Thursday 2 p.m. next week.
My name is Jennifer Bryan.